pace știm noi din vremuri strămoșești. Cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. простяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. This is an emergency live stream dedicated to the political memory of Keir Starmer, though he is not dead yet, but he apparently is very much on the way. The purpose of tonight's show is to explain why Keir Starmer is in the position that he is in, but it would not be this show if I did not use this opportunity to talk more clearly about the fact that Starmer is, of course, not the cause of the Labour Party's difficulties, even though, of course, he has done nothing to actually resolve them. But this is because, not just because he is a particularly inept politician, but because the Labour Party is structurally incapable of being anything other than what it is. Now, Well, first of all, before we get into the meat of the issue, ask everybody to like and share the stream. We are currently live on YouTube and on X and on Twitch and on Rumble and on Substack. So be sure to subscribe to all of those. And now, yes, somebody's already spotted late 1970s Scotland top because just to take a diversion into football for a moment, I have despised the English national team since I was old enough to watch football. I did support England at a couple of tournaments when I was younger. I haven't done so for many decades now because I find the English national team to be, quite frankly, some of the scummiest individuals that you could possibly put on a football field. They represent all the worst aspects of the sport. The people who go and see England games are some of the worst aspects, represent the worst aspects of English football because they're not actually from like the working class fans, because to actually go to an England game costs a hell of a lot of money and most working class people can't afford to do that. These are like lumpen petty bourgeois bastards, and I hate the England football team with every single fiber of my being. And so for quite a long time I've actually passively supported like Scotland or Wales or Ireland, um, anybody who England are playing, but unless it was literally like Third Reich's first 11, but even then you'd have to think twice. Um, I've supported other anybody other than England. So in this football year, if we do watch a game, it'll be watching the Scotland matches. Now I am not going to kid myself. The Scottish national team has a long and proud history of total utter failure in international tournaments. I'm wearing the shirt from the Scottish team that played in Argentina in 1978, who did as they always do and go out in the first round. And that was at a time when Scotland did have some seriously good players. In the period from like the late 60s to arguably the early 90s, but certainly from the late 60s to the mid 80s, they had people like Archie Gemmill, they had people like Kenny Dalglish, Graham Souness, various other players that were genuinely world class, and they could have done a lot better than they did. They didn't, though. They did. They turned in several performances of failure. Zhukov's Boots comments in the chat: rugby league is the sport of the working class. It's one of the sports of the working class. I mean, the split between rugby league and rugby union was based around like the more petty bourgeois and bourgeois rugby players wanting to keep it an amateur sport, and the working class players of the English Northwest and Wales and South Wales wanting it to be, and Yorkshire as well, wanting it to be paid to be for the sport. Now, rugby league for a long time remained the sport of the English Northwest, Yorkshire, and to a certain extent, Wales as well. It became more limited than rugby union, though it is played also in France and Spain. Rugby union is very much the sport of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie in England. There are some regional variations. So in South Wales, for instance, rugby union is also more of a working class sport. In Scotland, it's more of a petty bourgeois sport. Well, football is very much the sport of the Scottish working class. So that is our brief diversion into sport. If you want more diversions into sport, I can do them. But yeah, rugby league is in England at least has always been the more the sport of the working class. Cricket, more mixed. Again, like you have got in the past quite a lot of working class players, of the game of cricket, particularly from Yorkshire, Lancashire, etc. Now, interesting detail from Zukos Boots, who said that in the rugby league teams in France wouldn't collaborate with the Nazis during the occupation, whereas the rugby union teams did. Interesting variation. Didn't know about that. Draper Son Spaceman says, I support Liverpool and I am from England and never supported England. I think there is a lot of regional variations even in England itself. Like there is a lot of Liverpool fans have always said that they're Scouse, not English. You know, there's a big Irish influence in England. There's a big Irish influence across the northwest of England. In fact, one could argue that the northwest of England is the only successful example of Irish colonialism. That is, of course, a joke. So, moving on. One more comment on sport from President Jesus. In fact, we'll make this opening sports talk a segment in itself. President Jesus, who hails to us from the land of Gavin Newsom, says, I think baseball is still the cheapest sport to attend in the US. They just charge you $10 for a hot dog. Yeah, I did watch a baseball game when I was in the US in 1997. It retained my interest for a while, though. Okay, more rugby league comments here. It retained my interest for a while. I watched most of the game. I found the whole spectacle interesting. So yeah, I will get on to more sports talk in future episodes. Zukos Boots says that's why Union is bigger in France today. Pre-World War II, France was like Australia. League was bigger. So the reason why rugby union is big in France is because of the Nazis. Interesting. In it for fun says, and $40 what constitutes a brew. Not much better at Premier League football games, to be honest. I think the last time I was in a Premier League ground, it was like £5 or something for a beer. And it was a pretty shit beer as well. It was a Budweiser, the American Budweiser, not the Czech version. Anyway, sport aside, and if there is a demand for a sports cast, it will be provided. We now move to the fate of Keir Starmer. Now, what I want to present to you tonight is the reality of why the Labour Party is dying and why the crowning of King Gandhi the last or Queen Angela the last isn't going to make the blind bit of difference in reality, because it's the Labour Party itself which is the problem. And it's the problem is that it's just simply outlived its historical period. Now, there is a peculiar ritual, though, that has taken place across perfidious Albion every few years. It goes the same way, that the Labour Party suffers an electoral catastrophe or enacts some fresh criminal betrayal, and a chorus of left-wing media voices rise up to declare that this time, the leadership must change. If only we had somebody with more charisma. Wouldn't be difficult. If only the left could capture the party machinery. More on Corbyn later. If only the right wing could be out-organised. What nobody ever asks, though, what nobody on the left in Britain is really permitted to ask, is whether the problem is actually the leader or whether the problem is the party itself. Whether the Labour Party, as a historical formation, has not simply reached the end of its useful life. So today, what we're going to be doing is looking at this in a way that the British political commentariat, both the bourgeois media and the so-called alternative media, thinking of norovirus media and others, we're going to be looking at something that they find impossible to consider. So we're going to be looking at the Labour Party not as a vehicle for personalities, not as a stage for moral dramas, but as a structural component of British capitalism. We're going to trace its rise, its function, and its necessary decline. And we're going to explain why Sir Keir Starmer, who is, of course, about as charismatic as an IKEA bookcase, is not the cause of the party's sickness, but merely its most visible symptom. This is a broadcast brought to you by Liberation News Network. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. So let's start with the symptom and the disease. What is the immediate problem? The immediate problem is the fate of Keir Starmer, the man who campaigned for the Labour leadership in 2020 with these 10 pledges that included nationalisation of public utilities, abolishing tuition fees, and supporting free movement of labour into Britain, and has abandoned virtually all of these. The man who expelled Jeremy Corbyn from the PLP, the man who in February 2023 reportedly told his shadow cabinet that he was running a 1997 type project, by which he meant not a political vision for the future, but a technical operation to make Labour acceptable to the people who really matter. That is, of course, JP Morgan, the Vanguard Group, BlackRock, etc., the owners of the Daily Mail, the editors of the Financial Times, and the rich donors who abandoned Labour in the period that it was led by Jeremy Corbyn. So, the standard left critique of Keir Starmer is that he is a fraud, a liar, and a man without any principles. This is true as far as it goes, but this doesn't go very far, because the same thing was said about Tony Blair, about Neil Kinnock, about Harold Wilson, about Jim Callaghan, and about Clement Attlee. Every single Labour Party leader has, at some point, been denounced by the left as a betrayer. Every single one has been accused of sacrificing principle for office. Every single one has been the subject of some hopeful project to replace them with some great left hope. Or is that great left dope? What if the consistency of this pattern, though, tells us something? What if the betrayal isn't exceptional but structural? What if the Labour Party is not a vehicle that has been repeatedly hijacked by an evil bunch of right-wingers, but a machine that was built to do exactly what it keeps doing? Now, here's the thesis that I want to advance to you today. The Labour Party did not decline because it has bad leaders. It got bad leaders, meaning leaders who cannot inspire and cannot mobilise, who cannot even pretend to offer transformation, because it had already declined. The charisma vacuum at the top is a reflection of the vacuum at the bottom. There is nothing to inspire because there is nothing to offer. There is nothing to mobilise because there is nobody left to mobilise. And there is nothing to transform because transformation is structurally impossible. To understand why this is, we have to go back into the history, not to 2015 or 1983 or 1979. We have to go back to the moment when this party actually meant something to millions of working class people. And we have to understand what it meant and why it meant it, and why that meaning was made possible. Now, we must explore the Labour Party's actual moment of popularity. And that is, of course, we have to look at the Labour Party's reasons for being and its reasons why it gained any popularity amongst the working class. This was not a natural process. It was not inevitable. It was the product of a very specific historical moment that lasted roughly from 1945 to 1967. A moment in history so unusual that it has distorted British political memory ever since then. In 1945, the Labour Party won a landslide victory. They won 393 seats, the Conservatives 197. They carried out a programme of extensive nationalisations, including of the Bank of England, the coal industry, the railways, the steel industry, and the electricity and gas utilities, to name but some. They created the National Health Service. They built hundreds of thousands of council houses. They established the modern welfare state. They built a regime of welfare capitalism. And for a whole generation of working class people, this meant something tangible. It wasn't a mere set of ideas. It meant that they got a house that wasn't always infested with damp and falling to pieces. It meant you could go to the doctor without having to pay for it. It meant a pension that would sustain you, so you wouldn't die in the workhouse as soon as you'd been retired. It meant for the first time a sense that the British state actually worked for you, or at least wasn't simply an instrument of your oppression. But, and this is the crucial point that is almost always omitted from the sentimentalist narratives, we need to understand why this happened, not why Labour wanted it to happen. The Labour leadership of 1945 was not substantially more radical than Labour leadership was in 1931 or 1961. It was the same men, by and large, with the same instincts and the same deference to establishment power, the same horror and fear of actual working class militancy, that had been in the Labour Party leadership since the days of Ramsay MacDonald. Clement Attlee, the great reformer, had been in Ramsay MacDonald's government as a junior member of it. Ernest Bevin, the foreign secretary and rabid anti-communist who helped create NATO and permanently align Britain in the US-led imperialist bloc, had been before then the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union and a proud strikebreaker, both when he was a trade union leader and when he was Minister of Labour in World War II. What changed was not the Labour leadership. What changed was the balance of class forces. In 1945, the British ruling class was exhausted. It had had 6 years of war that had drained the treasury, destroyed infrastructure, killed and maimed hundreds of thousands, and left the British Empire dependent upon American credit. The Soviet Union had just destroyed the Nazi Wehrmacht at the cost of 27 million dead, and its prestige among the British working class was at an all-time high. Communist parties were riding high in France and Italy, but due to their role as leaders of the resistance in World War II. In Greece, a civil war raged between the British-backed monarchists and fascists and communist-led partisans. Across Europe, the question was not whether capitalism would continue to exist, but who would end it at that time. The British ruling classes understood, with the clarity that their descendants seemed to have lost, that reform here was cheaper than revolution. They understood that a hungry, demobilized working class armed with the memory of its own wartime sacrifices and the example of the Soviet Red Army was a dangerous proposition. And they understood that the Labour Party was the perfect instrument for managing this danger. Better to give Attlee and Ernest Bevin the trappings of office. Better to let them build council estates and nationalise the mines, which the bourgeoisie was sick of anyway, than to risk what happened and what was happening in Athens, happening in Glasgow or Edinburgh or Manchester or the East End of London. This is not speculation, it is documented in the archives of the period. The Conservative Party's manifesto of 1945 accepted the regime of welfare capitalism in principle. The House of Lords, which had tried to block Lloyd George's budgets in the 1900s because of their inclusion of certain social reforms, didn't actually obstruct the 1945 programme. The City of London complained but adapted because the alternative, the establishment of actual working class power, was truly unthinkable to them. But there is another dimension for this that is almost entirely neglected in the nostalgic left-wing accounts. The welfare capitalist period was paid for by two mechanisms that are deeply uncomfortable for the left-wing mythologizing of the 1945 Labour government. The first of these was the intensified exploitation of British colonies. This is not a matter of debate, it is a matter of economic record. As the economist Tony Norfield has demonstrated in his work on British imperialism, the post-war welfare state was sustained by extracting surplus from the colonies on a massive scale. Malayan rubber, West African cocoa, Indian textiles, Middle Eastern oil all flowed into British-controlled channels, all contributed to the balance of payments that made domestic spending possible. The British working class got the NHS and council houses in significant part because the Malayan peasantry was being murdered en masse for resisting colonial taxation, because the Kenyan Kikuyu were being herded into concentration camps, because the Iranian government was being overthrown simply for trying to nationalise its own oil industry. This is not to say that the British workers were simply bought off with colonial blood money. The relationship is more complex than that. But it is to say that the material basis for social democracy in Britain was imperialism, always imperialism. The Labour Party's reform programme was not an alternative to empire, it was a product of empire, a redistribution of imperial surplus within the metropolitan working class. The second mechanism was equally important and equally obscured. The post-war reform coincided with a long wave of capitalist expansion. Reconstruction in Europe, the Korean War boom, the development of consumer markets, the relative stability of the Bretton Woods system, all of this generated growth that made redistribution possible without threatening profitability. When the economy is growing, the ruling class can afford, at certain stages, to give the workers a larger slice of the action without feeling like their own rule is threatened. When the growth stops, this dynamic changes, and the growth did stop. It stopped around the period between 1964 and 1967, and the signs became unmistakable. turning point here really comes in 1967. That's not a date that looms large in the popular memory, but it should, because 1967 was the year that the Labour government, headed by Harold Wilson, devalued the pound. It was the year that the post-war economic model, Keynesian demand management, welfare spending, and a commitment to full employment began to visibly unravel. Wilson had come to power in 1964 on a platform of modernisation. He referred to it as the white heat of technology. A new Britain was going to be forged in the white heat of the scientific revolution. It was mostly rhetoric, but it was rhetoric that still had an element of belief in it regarding the possibility of reform, that still imagined that the British state could direct capitalism towards social ends. By 1967, that belief was very much dead. The balance of payments crisis forced devaluation. The US was demanding British support for the Vietnam War in exchange for financial support. The imperial surplus was drying up as decolonisation and the anti-colonial revolutions accelerated, and the domestic working class, far from tugging their forelocks and being grateful for the reforms of the previous generations, was actually becoming more militant. Strikes were on the rise. The shop stewards movement was growing. In 1966, the seafarers' strike had brought Wilson into direct conflict with organised labour. And in 1969, the Wilson government attempted something that no Labour government had dared do before. It tried to legislate against the trade unions. Minister Barbara Castle's white paper, named In Place of Strife, proposed legal restrictions on strikes, compulsory cooling off periods, and state intervention in industrial disputes. It was the first explicitly anti-union legislation proposed by a Labour government, but it wouldn't be the last. It was defeated in the end, not by the Tories, of course, but by the trade union movement itself, with a rank-and-file response that frightened the Labour Party into dropping the plan. Barbara Castle, of course, is held up to this day as some sort of great working-class heroine when she's nothing of the kind. The way to properly describe her, of course, would be as a scab, which is what she was. But the signal here had been clearly sent. The reform period was very much over. The Labour Party, which had built its credibility on delivering consistent improvements in working class life, was now proposing to restrict working class bargaining power. And the poorer sections of the working class, the people who had never really been incorporated into the Labour aristocracy, that is, the great majority of the working class, but who had benefited the least also from the welfare state, and who worked in casualised sectors and declining industries, they began to drift away. They didn't go to the Tories. They just stopped believing. They stopped participating in, certainly in the Labour Party. They stopped turning out to vote for the Labour Party. Some would eventually go off and vote for the Tories, but that was a minority. They stopped seeing the Labour Party as theirs at the end of the 1960s, and the party never that captured again the kind of mass enthusiasm that the period 45 to 51 had generated, because the material basis for that enthusiasm had vanished. What followed was a long, slow decline, disguised by periodic flurries of recovery. Wilson won again in 74, but the 74 to 79 government was a disaster for social democracy. The IMF crisis of 1976, when the Labour government accepted spending cuts and monetary targets in exchange for an IMF loan, was the formal admission that the reformist project was utterly dead. James Callaghan's 1976 speech to the Labour Party conference, where he explicitly rejected Keynesianism and told the unions there will be no more spending our way out of a recession, was a confirmation of this total embrace of ideological surrender. Then came, of course, the Welsh windbag himself, Neil Kinnock, and the electoral defeat of 1983 should have been a moment of reckoning for Labour leadership, but it wasn't. It became, in actual fact, a moment of entrenchment. Kinnock's project, which began in earnest after 83 and culminated in his leadership, which ran from 83 to 92, was not to rebuild Labour as a working class party. It was to rebuild it as a party, again, of the Labour aristocracy and the managerial layers of the upper working class. The people who had done the most to gain out of the post-war period. The union officials, the local government professionals, the university-educated activists who had moved from the student movement into the party apparatus. The great bulk of the working class, by which I mean people who actually work to produce surplus value in manufacturing, logistics, retail, or more precarious service sectors, they had no role in this party and they were not welcome in it. The language changed to reflect this. Modernisation meant accepting Thatcher's economic framework. Reaching out meant appealing to middle-class voters in southern England. Pragmatism meant abandoning anything that might frighten the City of London. Kinnock's war against the militant tendency, for instance, in Liverpool was not, as is often portrayed in the bourgeois press, a necessary purge of extremists. It was a declaration of class war within the Labour Party against any few remaining working class militants. Liverpool in the 80s was a city that had been devastated by deindustrialisation, with unemployment in some areas exceeding 20%. The militant-controlled city council, and it should be emphasised that the actual number of people in the Liverpool City Council who were, we might call, paid-up members of militant was very few, but they were the most political element and they were the most organised faction within the Merseyside Labour Party, and they came to be the controlling influence in the council. Now, they did, in fact, build council homes in the 80s. They did try and use the power of the council to create jobs, and they did defy Thatcher's policy of rate capping. Kinnock expelled them and destroyed them, not because those policies were unpopular, but because their politics, which was, for all that you could criticise militant for various mistakes they did make, was based on working class self-activity and actually trying to organise some resistance to the power of capital. This was intolerable to the Labour Party leadership and intolerable to the kind of party Kinnock wanted to build. Now, each successive leader after Kinnock, who was rewarded for his work on the Labour Party by being given a very well-paid non-job in the European Commission, each successive leader after him made this situation worse. John Smith, who's remembered with fondness by people like Mr. Galloway, he accelerated the destruction of the trade union bloc vote. Blair completed the transformation into a party of professional managerial liberalism, with a membership that was increasingly southern, university educated, and economically comfortably off. Brown was a brief and worthless interlude. Miliband, that's Ed Miliband, who looks like he might be staging an unlikely comeback. Maybe he's going to bring Russell Brand back with him. Miliband tried to do some kind of appeal to the working class via his flirtation with Blue Labour and ultimately failed. Corbyn was an anomaly, and we'll come to him in just a moment. But the structural trajectory of the Labour Party was clear. The party's social base was narrowing every year. Its working class vote was ageing and dying off and not being replaced. Its membership was becoming a self-selected group of people who could afford the time and money for party activism. Its policies were constrained by the need to appear credible to the financial markets, which meant accepting the fundamental elements that had been institutionalized by Margaret Thatcher and John Major. And here we need to be precise about what this neoliberal period means in this context. It doesn't mean just privatization and deregulation, though it includes those things. It means the restructuring of British capitalism in such a way that the space for reform, the space that made 1945 possible, is permanently closed. It means capital mobility, which makes nationalisation threatening because capital can flee. It means financialisation, which means any redistribution potentially destabilising to asset prices. It means that the European Union and World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund are there to constrain national policy autonomy. It means, in short, a world in which the British state could not do what Clement Attlee did, even if it wanted to. And it certainly doesn't want to. Now we come, of course, to St. Jeremy of Islington, our old friend. Now, Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party in 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, is the great puzzle for anyone trying to understand the party's decline, because Corbyn did briefly mobilise something that appeared to be mass enthusiasm. Hundreds of thousands did indeed join the party, including me. Rallies drew crowds not seen since the 50s. The 2017 election manifesto, entitled For the Many, Not the Few, proposed nationalisation, rent controls, free education, a national investment bank, and other social democratic reforms that had been unmentioned by the Labour Party for decades. And yet, Corbyn's support, as I argued earlier on in this video, came substantially from the same layers that had sustained the party since Kinnock: the university-educated, public sector professionals, the trade union bureaucracy that had made its peace with neoliberalism, but was willing to make a left turn after the 2008 crash, had exposed the system's failures and actually brought these layers dangerously close to becoming more impoverished. These people are not the unemployed of Liverpool in the 80s or the workers who are on 0 hours contracts in the gig economy. They were people who had been radicalized by austerity, but not proletarianized by it. This matters because it explains both the enthusiasm and the limits. The 2017 election was remarkable in some senses. Corbyn's Labour Party did win 40% of the vote, the highest share of the vote since 2001. They did gain 30 seats. They did do this by mobilising a large number of young people and by re-engaging with some working class areas. They offered some elements of hope against the Tory narrative of managerial competence, or attempted managerial competence, I should say. But her structural constraints remained. The manifesto, which was radical by recent standards, was still fundamentally a weak reformist document. It proposed to work within the existing financial architecture. It accepted NATO and Trident and the monarchy and the framework of imperialism. It was, in essence, an attempt to recreate 1945 without the conditions that made the government of 1945 to 51 possible. And when the ruling class mobilised against it, which they were always going to, and the bourgeois press launched the most sustained campaign of vilification in modern British history, when the BBC offered systematically distorted coverage, when the Parliamentary Labour Party sabotaged its own leader from within, when the false anti-Semitism narrative was weaponised to try and destroy Corbyn, the structural weakness became apparent. Corbyn had no independent base of working class power. He had no organs of class struggle available to him outside the party. He had no capacity to resist the ruling class offensive because his supporters were largely not organised in workplaces and communities. They were largely organised on Twitter and to a certain extent in some Labour Party constituency meetings. And when the ruling class put its foot down, there was nobody to really fight back in an organised way. The 2019 defeat was indeed devastating, not just the scale of it, because it was the worst result since 1935, but the nature of it. Labour lost its so-called Red Wall, the deindustrialised working class constituencies of the English Midlands and North that had been Labour since the party's foundation. They lost them not to a social democratic alternative, not to any kind of workers' party, but to Boris Johnson's Tories, who promised to get Brexit done and to level up the country as a result. Now, this was all lies, but Labour lost to a man who was a manifest liar anyway. The interpretation of this defeat has been almost entirely wrong. The dominant narrative, which is promoted by Starmer and the Labour Party right-wingers, is that Corbyn was too radical, too left-wing, too out of touch with so-called aspirational voters. The opposite is closer to the truth, though. Corbyn was nowhere near radical enough. He was not radical enough in the ways that mattered. He did not challenge the imperialist framework that defines British bourgeois politics. He did not challenge the financial markets. He did not challenge the media monopolists. He offered a kinder, gentler capitalism at a moment when capitalism was not in a kind or gentle mood. And when he was destroyed, the lessons drawn by the Labour Party establishment was that not that they needed a deeper connection with the working class, but that they needed to become completely inoffensive to the ruling class. Enter the man himself, Sir Keir. Now, Keir Starmer is the perfect leader for the Labour Party as it exists today. That is not a compliment, of course. He has no real politics in the sense that there is no weather in a vacuum. He believes nothing except that the technical management of the system is better done by him. His 1997 project is not a project for any kind of transformation. It is a project for restoration of the Labour Party's role as the alternative to the Conservatives, restoration of the old Blair project, which was, of course, to make, as Peter Mandelson used to put it, the natural party of government. So restoration of the status quo anti-Corbyn, which was the status quo anti-Blair, which was the status quo anti-Kinnock. The 10 pledges Starmer made in 2020 were not lies in the conventional sense. They were structural impossibilities made by a man who understood, or quickly came to understand, that there were structural impossibilities. He promised nationalisation because he needed the left's support to win the leadership. He abandoned nationalisation because he needed the ruling class's support to win the general election. The only consistency with Starmer was, of course, his pursuit of office as an end in itself. And this is where we have to be absolutely clear. It does not matter who leads the Labour Party. It does not matter whether it's Starmer or Angela Rayner or Andy Burnham or Wes Streeting or the ghost of Keir Hardie. The question is not one of personnel. The question is one of the structure. The British ruling class in 2026 is not weakened by war. It is not facing revolutionary threats from the militant power of the working class. It does not face a Soviet Union with all the prestige and power that it once had. It faces instead a working class that's been systematically disorganized, deindustrialized, demobilized, and atomized. It faces no external pressure to reform. It faces an economic system, financialized, post-Brexit, dependent on hot money inflows and asset price inflation, in which any serious redistribution would trigger immediate capital flight, sterling crisis, and economic collapse. This is not speculation. This is the structural reality that any Labour Party leader confronts. The room for social democracy does not exist because the conditions that created that room no longer exist. And the social base for the Labour Party is withered away because the party has nothing to offer its old constituency. Consider the membership figures. In 1952, the Labour Party had close to 1 million individual members. Even the Tories at the time had a similar number. Today, Labour claims around 370,000 members, but that figure is inflated by registered supporters and some very questionable accounting. The actual active membership is a fraction of that. More importantly, the social composition has inverted. The party that was founded by trade unions, that built its strength in the industrial working class, is now disproportionately composed of university graduates, highly paid public sector professionals, NGO professionals, and people who live in London and the South East. The trade union link, once the party's defining feature, is now largely formal. The big unions, Unite, Unison, GMB, these are bureaucratic machines whose leaderships are increasingly detached from their memberships. Look at the turnout for votes in internal union elections. Sometimes it hovers as low as 5%. And on a good day, they get 12%. These machines fund the Labour Party not because the party serves working class interests, but because the alternative, breaking the link and fighting for the building of independent working class organisation, is terrifying to these career bureaucrats. It provokes too much uncertainty. It would involve too much work, too much risk. They'd rather queue up for an ermine robe and an invite to join the House of Lords. And the voters. In 2019 election, Labour's vote share among the working class defined by occupation was lower than the Conservatives for the first time in history. In 2024, Starmer won a landslide majority with a smaller share of the popular vote than Corbyn got. In 2019, he won because the Conservative vote collapsed, not because Labour's vote surged. Remember, he won fewer votes in terms of numbers in 2019 than Corbyn, in 2024 than Corbyn did in 2019. He won because the first past the post system rewards geographic concentration, not popular enthusiasm. He won, in essence, by default. What does this party actually do in office under Starmer and before him under Blair and Brown? The 13 years of those two clowns delivered at best temporary and partial improvements for workers. The minimum wage, yes, but set below the level of a living wage. Tax credits, yes, but not as something for the workers, but as a subsidy to low-paying employers to enable the further casualisation of work. Sure start centres, yes, but these were rapidly undone by the coalition government that followed. The improvements were not structural, they were contingent. They depended on the continued growth of the British economy and continued Labour government. When the Tories returned, they were dismantled with ease. And what part of the Blair-Brown legacy was not dismantled? The PFI debts, saddling hospitals and schools with decades of repayments to private investors. The Iraq War, of course, wasn't going to be undone, based on lies and destroying a whole nation, destabilizing a whole region. The financial deregulation that made 2008 and the crash then possible. The continuation of Thatcher's anti-union laws. These were not betrayals of Labour's principles. They were the logical extension of the party's structural role to manage capitalism in a way that appears humane while preserving its fundamental power relations. When social democracy becomes reformism without reforms, there is no actual reason for the working class to support it. The Labour Party in 2026 offers nothing that can't also be offered by the Tories or by the Reform Party. In some cases, on immigration, law and order, and military spending, Reform offer to go much further. The party exists as a kind of political zombie, animated by habit and institutional inertia, but dead in any meaningful sense. Now, I want to be precise here about what I mean about saying that reforming the current British system is a structural impossibility. I don't mean that it is politically difficult. I don't mean that it would require a large parliamentary majority or favourable media coverage. I mean that the structural conditions that made reform possible in 1945 are absent and cannot be recreated. In 1945, the British state still had significant policy autonomy. Capital controls could be established to prevent capital flight. The empire provided external resources. The domestic economy was still very heavily influenced by a capital that was more nationally based, not purely transnational finance. The trade union movement was strong, organised, and was capable of industrial action on a mass basis. And most importantly of all, the Soviet Union provided an external example that made the ruling class's compromises more rational from their point of view. None of those conditions exist today. Capital is globally mobile. A government that attempted serious nationalisation would face immediate capital flight, a run on the pound, and a banking crisis. The British imperialism has fundamentally changed, and British external economic relations are characterised by dependence upon American military muscle. It's also dependent upon speculative investments. The trade union movement has been legally constrained and structurally weakened by decades of deindustrialization, and there is no external power offering an alternative model. The Soviet Union is long gone. And China, while it is very economically significant, does not present any kind of revolutionary threat to British capitalism in the same way that the USSR in the 1940s did. The British economy is now structured around asset price inflation, house prices, stock prices, and financial instruments, rather than productive investment. Any redistribution that threatened asset values would alienate not just the bourgeois, but the petty bourgeois and higher paid labour aristocrats whose wealth is tied up in property. This is why even mild proposals that would be useless, like mansion taxes or a rearrangement of the council tax bands, provoke hysterical opposition. The material interests of a small but significant section of the population are now aligned with the maintenance of the status quo. And finally, the British state is deeply ingrained into the imperialist structures of the US-led bloc, NATO, the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, the financial networks of the City of London, or this constrain any attempt at an independent policy. A British government that seriously challenged US imperialism, for instance, that refused to participate in US imperialism's military adventures, that sought to get rid of nuclear weapons, would not just face diplomatic pressure, but as Dick Cheney once admitted to, active and Mike Pompeo once admitted to, active sabotage from within the state apparatus itself and from the American assets. The intelligence services, the military, the civil service, these are, of course, not neutral instruments. These are institutions of class rule, and they would act to protect the interests that they represent. Given all of this, what could a Labour government actually do? It could tinker around the margins. It could increase public spending slightly, funded by borrowing or modest tax increases. It could improve some regulatory frameworks. It could, in short, manage capitalism with maybe a degree less brutality than the Conservatives or Reform would do. But it could not transform it. It wouldn't even be able to go back to the modest social democracy of Harold Wilson's early period. The space for that has closed. The working class know this. Even if they don't articulate it in these terms, they know the Labour Party is not going to do anything for them. They know that the promises are empty. They know this from long and bitter experience, that the party that claims to represent them will betray them when it matters. And most of them now either don't vote or they vote for other parties. They vote in the past for the Conservatives, or they're going to vote for Reform out of some kind of nihilistic despair. So what comes next, so to speak? If the Labour Party is structurally incapable of offering any kind of meaningful reform and structurally incapable of representing the working class, then what is to be done? To quote a classic, This is the question that the British left has failed to answer for many decades, and it is the question that we must eventually confront. The historic role of the Labour Party was to incorporate the working class into capitalist politics, as Ralph Miliband observed, to channel working class discontent into safe parliamentary forms, to negotiate between capital and labour within the framework of imperialist welfare capitalism. That role is now exhausted not because the party has failed, but because the system it managed no longer exists. This creates both a problem and an opportunity. The problem is that the British working class lacks any kind of political representation. It lacks organisations. It lacks, in many areas, even the memory of collective struggle. The trade unions are weak. The left is fragmented. The Communist Party of Britain is a reformist Khrushchevite joke. The various Trotskyist groups are sectarian and isolated. There is no mass workers' party and no immediate prospect of one. But the opportunity is that the illusion of representation has also been shattered. The Labour Party no longer deceives anyone except its own dwindling membership. The gap between what the working class needs and what parliamentary politics can deliver is visible to anybody with eyes to see it. And in that gap there is space, difficult, dangerous and uncertain space, though it does exist now, for rebuilding working class organisations. What form that takes we at this moment cannot predict. It may emerge from new trade union struggles in certain economically important sectors, may emerge from organisations inside working class communities. But the struggle is real, and the class struggle, will re-emerge. And to dismiss that is to dismiss the eternal laws of class struggle. What we can say is that nothing positive will emerge from the Labour Party. The Labour Party is not a vehicle to be captured, as some foolish enterists still believe. It is a structure to be understood and ultimately to be buried. Its history is not a history of betrayed potential. It is a history of successful management. Successful, that is, from the perspective of the British ruling class. It kept the working class quiet when quiet was necessary. It delivered reforms when reforms were possible. And now, when reforms are impossible, it delivers nothing at all, except to the careers of its parliamentarians and the delusions of its remaining members. Keir Starmer is the perfect expression of this terminal phase. The IKEA bookcase, an empty vessel, the man who believes in nothing because there is nothing to believe in. He is not the cause of the Labour Party's decline. He is just merely its most acute symptom. And when he is gone, when the next Labour leader takes his place, the decline will continue. Because this is not the decline of a party, it is of a whole historical model, the model of social democracy, the model of reformist gradualism, the model of imperialist welfare capitalism. And that, in the end, is what we have to understand. The Labour Party's crisis is British capitalism's crisis, refracted through the particular history of a party that was built to manage the contradictions of British capitalism. When the management is no longer possible, the manager becomes redundant. Starmer, therefore, is redundant. The party is redundant. And the question for us is, what do we build out of the ruins? Now, this takes us to the end of the broadcast for tonight. I hope that you have gained some insight from this into the reason why Keir Starmer is, in the words of Malcolm Tucker, fucked like Caligula's favourite watermelon. So, thanks for joining the stream tonight. There will be a Decline and Fall episode out for you very soon. So I hope you'll all tune into that one. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. You can find details of those in the description of the stream below. More stuff coming up on Patreon this week. We have a delayed Q&A coming up tomorrow, so please join me for that. But until then, thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thank you for all of those of you who have recently subscribed. The channel is growing, and it's good to be having the word be spread. Thanks for tuning in. Be back with you again.